Countdown. You ready? Countdown? Yeah. Okay. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 10th reading of this, our 15th season of the Milwaukie Poetry Series. I'm Tom Hogan, the coordinator of the series, and I want to welcome you here this evening. We know that you have a lot of choices, and so we're very appreciative of you spending time with us tonight. We're going to have our poet, Jennifer Perrine, who I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, who is with us this evening. Some thanks I want to make first. Thanks to the City of Milwaukie for supporting the Milwaukie Poetry Series, for the Letting Library. We've been connected with the Letting Library this entire time, and so a big thanks to the Letting Library. A big thanks to the Milwaukie Poetry Series Committee. We do have a committee, and as you've heard me say many times, that you don't have something happen like this or anything unless you have a group of people working on it. So a big thanks to the Milwaukie Poetry Series Committee. And finally, and fourthly, a big thanks to Willamette Falls Media Center. We are here at the Media Center, live streaming tonight. This reading is going to be available on demand, on recording, on the Letting Library YouTube channel after the reading, but we are live tonight here in the studio. And a big thanks to our technician from Willamette Falls, Josh Reynolds, who is in the control room, and also Bev Spurgeon, who is a committee member and who is working with Josh to bring this to you, because without them, we wouldn't have this event tonight. I want to say a couple of things about events that are coming up. Our reading in July was to have been by our dear friend Ann Staley. But as we know, Anne has lost her battle with cancer. So our reading in July on the 13th is going to be a tribute reading to Anne, in which we're going to read her work. There's going to be some details on that that's going to come out in the invitation, but that's the 13th of July at 6 o'clock here. Secondly, our First Friday programs have started. And these programs we co-sponsor with St. John the Evangelist in Milwaukie. And our First Friday program in July is actually going to be on the second Friday. The reason for that is the first Friday falls during the 4th of July weekend. But the featured readers that night, and we're working with them at Wheatfield Fall on that, are going to be honoring Black American poets. So again, there will be some more information about that in the invitation when it comes out, but that's going to be the 8th of July coming up. Now, we're very fortunate to have our poet tonight, Jennifer Perrine, who is with us, and I am happy to introduce her. Jennifer, and I believe it's Perrine.
Yes.
Thank you. Jennifer is the author of 4 award-winning books of poetry. Again, The Body is No Machine, In the Human Zoo, and No Confession, No Mass. Their recent short stories and essays appear in Buckman Journal and the Gay and Lesbian Review. She lives in Portland, Oregon, where they co-host the Insight Queer Writers Read series, teach creative writing to youth and adults, and serve as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice consultant. In talking with Jennifer before the reading, I also learned that she leads wilderness treks, journeys into the wilderness. So that'd be nice. We'll see if we hear a little bit more about that in the Q&A. We are going to have a question and answer period after the reading. So if there's something that you have of interest and you want to ask, put it in the chat. To learn more about her, visit her website at www.jenniferperrine.org. Would you join me in welcoming our poet this evening, Jennifer Perrine?
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks to all of you in the audience as well, both here and those of you who are watching the live stream. There will be some appearances of the wilderness in these poems, but I think I'm going to start with a few poems about grief. I'll start on sort of the harder poems and hopefully move towards some of the lighter ones. These first 3 poems specifically are about grieving the death of my mother after a long estrangement from her. And each of these 3 poems, they all borrow phrases from Buddhist teacher Larry Young's 4 Directions of Forgiveness practice. And so if you read down the right-hand side of this poem, the phrases that appear is, may I forgive myself, and if I cannot do so in this moment, may I be able to forgive myself in the future. After I stopped counting the days. Dear Mother, it's almost May again, whether I believe in spring or not. Forgive me. Time has been scattershot. I haven't been myself, or have been too much. The camellia is dropping its blooms, and the rhododendron is a riot of stars, if you can believe it. They keep coming back, even though I have forgotten to water or prune. I cannot remember the last time I did more than admire from a distance. Do you? There is so much sunshine these days, it startles me. Even in the evenings, it sends white rays until 8. This feels unnatural, but is not. Give me a moment. I lost the thread of my thought. I may as well pick it up here. I miss you is not exactly true. I don't need you here, only I want you to still be somewhere. You can look to the fireworks atop a palm tree, where you're able to gather whelks and olive shells from the beach, to do whatever you love best. Forgive me for not knowing what that is. When I find myself gazing hard at the maples, I am not looking for the silver lining its underside. I am in our yard again, another year gone, the time when I might have climbed those branches for a better view of this future. So this poem, if you read down the left-hand side of the page, it spells out another one of these phrases from that same practice, Larry Yang's. This one reads vertically, "May you forgive me, and if you cannot do so in this moment, may you be able to forgive me in the future." Except, of course, for Mother's Day, May holds no particular significance. When I think of you, it is always winter. I am tracing figures in the frost. Forgive the irises, their showy displays. They can't help themselves. They want to steer me away from my sackcloth and ashes, have convinced me at last to start dancing again. And when I play certain songs, I am not reminded of you exactly, but if I hum each note, I am pierced by the sting of snow across my skin. You are always driving. I am forever pressing my face to the ice-bitten glass. I cannot see the stars, but I am trying so hard. Do I tell you again that I am well enough alone? I have made a life so you can go easier into death. Your boyfriend said you stayed in your body long enough for me to be by your side. I wish I could believe this were true. Let me show you who I am in this moment, waiting for the invisible webs to accumulate in windows, in eaves, so they may catch dandelion seeds. Let them twist in the wind. You were never one for keeping house. I blame you less and less each day. Pray may you be happy, may you be free. Only for the slimmest second do I resent how you were able to leave your children behind. I know what it is to make a life and then run from it. If I sound angry, forgive me. My tongue has been practicing for 40 years and still gives me grief. If I cannot speak the words yet, loss or love, they live in my body nevertheless, because I am made from you. The impulse to flee has always been here too. Even in this future, I am still looking over your cold shoulder, cold comfort this spring day brings. I think I'll read one more from this set. So in this one, the phrase running down the right side of the page is, "May I forgive you, and if I cannot do so in this moment, may I be able to forgive you in the future." And the title is a true scientific fact. No object can float without some part of it being below the surface. Dear Mother, you send no cards from the afterlife to your 2 children born in May. I cannot be the only one to notice this neglect of etiquette. I did not call on your birthday or any other day for years. Forgive my quarters slipped into fountains instead of payphones, dial tones I severed, afraid you would not answer. I've kept the message you composed after your aneurysm and 2 poems you wrote. Years I have studied them for what you meant. I know better. If there is a meaning in a text, the reader must be willing to make it. I struggle to make each day new. When the alarm goes off, I cannot bring myself to believe I will meet in the mirror a face worth greeting. I always do haul myself awake. 4 years ago, I plunged into a lake so cold I shook for hours after. My partner had to ask if I was trying to do myself in. I only wanted to go for a swim. This is how it was between us. What might have been a moment of welcome bliss always had an edge of the dangerous. Some may say you were doing your best. I know you were. And yet, still I invite the question, who I would be if you had not left. No matter how many rivers I wade through, I'm never able to come clean, to untether my anger, let it float easy as cottonwood seeds, to let these catkins open so June appears wild with snow. What can't the wind forgive? All the things it's expected to carry. If I were another person, I might think you were giving me a sign. When a breeze slices the curtains, the sun stumbles in. I do not believe you've started speaking to me after all this time. If the light gets in, it's not proof you're with me. It's just clouds moving on to meet their future. This next poem is written as one long sentence, so we'll see if I have the lung capacity to pull it off. Last night, I had such good dreams. I woke myself up laughing, and today I went down to the lake and sat for an hour listening to ice shift and break into endless shards, its creaking ceaseless, and I did not think of you much, or of how I am not as good as you were at making French toast, or rice even, how I cooked a huge batch to last me the week, and remembered too late how you used to rinse the grains to keep them from sticking. So I wound up with 8 cups of thick goop, and said to myself, some Asian you are. And when I forgave myself for fucking up the rice, I wondered whose voice that was, yours or mine, or the great collective mouth that hums through the cloud and thinks it knows best how I should grieve, says, get over it already. And just for a while this evening, after I came back from that vast expanse of water, those brittle crystals splintering and coming to rest on the shore, I thought I had gotten over it, or you, as I gazed up at the full moon rising through the trees and wondered how another month had passed. And I said out loud to that satellite, that desolate rock that does nothing but orbit and reflect light and drive the tides, I said, look how far I have come. I am still here. I have survived the worst of it. I woke up laughing last night. When was the last time that happened? And when the moon answered back with its wild silence, I realized too late I was never talking to the moon at all, that when I speak to an empty place, I am always speaking to you. I always like to read something new at every event, and this poem is about as new as it gets. If it's finished, which I'm not sure if it is, it was finished this morning. So you all are the first ever to hear it. Dear Ghost, today I placed a coin under your tongue, and we rode the ferry together, not across a lake or poison river, but through a strait, into the fogged sea, until we reached the island where we once kayaked, drunk on summer. As we strolled along the main road fettered with orange construction cones, I read the warning sign, loose gravel, nudged your spectral ribs, asked, what jerk is slut-shaming rocks? Your laugh never came, even when I spotted fresh oil a block later and placed the blame on its smart mouth. You offered no chuckle, no howl, no hint of your voice, did not join in with the obvious quip. It's crude. You refused a smile, even a smirk, just lurched your shadowy limbs beside mine to the restaurant where I ordered the habanero salsa that gives me heartburn and is your favorite, though today you ate not a drop, on account, I assume, of the coin in your mouth. At dusk, I brought you to the western shore and watched the sunset as you taught me years before, tilting my head to the side so the horizon divided, stripes of green, pink, violet, each their own distinct delight. You remained upright, 1,000-yard stare affixed to a gull gone almost still in the air, or to a low cloud, or to another ghost I could not see. In the dark, I brushed each trace of sand from your phantom face, walked to the shifting space where water lapped at the land, dipped my hands in its bite. I left them to numb as far suns populated the night. When I lifted a raw, dripping finger to the binary star hovering above us, I waited for you to boast about my eyesight, how spotting this pair, their twinned light, might once have destined me for archery. The sea reached and left the beach. I listened. I watched the two stars bound in orbit around each other, swim out of focus, blur to a single glow, a lone body, an untrue view. During the pandemic, I have discovered the joys of birding, which I'm very grateful for. It's been kind of a lifesaver. And I recently, within the last month, saw my first Western tanager. And also last week was Blackbirders Week. And I think this poem is perhaps a confluence of those events. Western tanager. In the forest just outside of Portland, I spotted you, a scarlet burst of flame among the stand of Douglas firs. Then came your flash of yellow belly, a short-lived glimpse before you disappeared. I admit, I thought your colors exotic, wondered how you hid from cowbirds who would plunder your nest, how you dared to flit your brilliant plumage through the canopy where sharp-shinned hawks could sight you with ease among the green. You chuckled at me. I sang back a plea. When a white neighbor notices the tint of my skin, stops me as I walk my dogs to say, I've never seen you here before. How do I keep flying? Do I ignore the whiff of predator or count the odds of whether my vivid body will be allowed to continue to gleam and glint and breathe? You rustled the leaves, fell silent, your brilliance obscured by the shroud of trees. I have been writing, I write many poems in series, and one of these series, they all borrow lyrics from songs from my childhood, which was the late 70s and 80s. And I grew up in New Jersey, so it was sort of inevitable that at least one of those songs would be by Bruce Springsteen. So this is a poem that, like some of the other earlier poems, it can be read in sort of multiple directions. If you read down the left side of the page, it reads "Born in the USA." If you read down the right side of the page, it borrows another lyric from the poem, "The Yellow Man," and then the title is also a lyric from the poem, "You Spend Half Your Life Just Covering Up." Because no matter how many times I answer the question, is it okay to use exotic if I put it in quotes? I wonder what I mean when I select both races, what forms in me each time I know you're looking me in the eye, negates any location I have found in this body, makes me lose focus when you say, is it okay though if I am citing what someone else wrote, if I meant nothing by it, meant it as a joke? No quarter, no hiding if I respond to texts that ask, how do you feel this week? Are you okay after the shootings in Atlanta? Who can I tell how I stopped walking alone all this last year? How I go everywhere with dogs in tow. Animals humanize me. Instead, I send sorrow, rage, sorrow, until you block me or offer, okay, well, would you at least tell me when I am saying something racist? In this equation, I am a resource, exhausted again. In this formula, any answer I give is a half answer. Any answer arrives through the mouth of an American. And yet another series that I've been working with is I was introduced to this technique right around 2 years ago. It was just after the beginning of the pandemic. I was introduced by the editors of Broadsided Press to the technique called the Beautiful Outlaw, which is an Oulipo form. And I've been using it ever since then to write just poem after poem. And the gist of the form is each stanza excludes one letter, so it cannot be used at all in that stanza, but all of the other letters of the English alphabet must be used. And then the letters that are absent in each stanza spell out the title of the poem. So, like in many things, I've discovered that in this process, inclusion is much more challenging than exclusion. It's easy to cut a letter out. It's much harder to get those Z's and X's and Q's in there. So this poem is called Rage. And so an R will be absent, then an A, then a G, then an E. So you can listen for the absences or for the presence of the other letters, or you can just listen to it as a poem. Rage. I've been told my placid attitude must hide some menace. Mostly it doesn't. Mostly I'm content to kick back in the sun, flicking at any mosquitoes bold enough to sip at my skin. I get my fill of excitement gazing up into the waving limbs of the old walnut, watching the oak with its galls full of wasps jettison catkins. Mostly, I've adopted sloth as my vice of choice. So if my voice comes out too brittle or loud, it could be the growls I've stifled when townsfolk scrutinize me, checking for points to my teeth, for fur tucked up my sleeves. It could be when their torches set fire to neighbors' houses, I've extinguished my cries. I've gotten wind of their jokes, their critiques of my eyes, too golden, too lupine. I keep my wild from busting out. I know it could happen if my steadiness drifts into a snarl or shout. I've learned not to leave the house when I feel a certain set to my jaw, an untamed pulse in my chest. I can't excise the beast. I don't transform. It's part of me, as much as the skin in which I was born, as much as the soul pleased to pass a day in study of a covey of quail at play in a zealous dust bath, all shimmy and flapping wings. I wish for such jubilant, haphazard abandon. If fury stings my throat, I try to pay it no mind. My kind was taught to wait out pitchforks and plots that paint us as villains. But I still know how to bound through moonlight, to transfix a mob with chilling howls, to slash a quaking thing to ribbons. I'll gut what I must to go on living. About 5 or 6 years ago, I began writing poems about American gun culture, and I suspect I started writing them because of mass shootings. So I'm going to share a few of those many poems that I've written over those years. And this first one was written on June 12th, 2017, which was a year after the shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, where 50 people, most of whom were Latine and LGBTQ, were murdered. We call this an anniversary, as if something were born that night. Music, the flint that sparked electric through muscle, through sinuous spine, every nerve alight, pulse that leapt each synapse, thrum that filled gaps, spaces where we fled to be safe, brave-faced in the dark that kept time, that pressed us close as if we needed one another's sweat to survive. We do. The breath of the drum, the hum of bass echoes in our hollows. The beat goes on. We whirl and sway in tune with what we have lost. When the DJ winds down, closes up shop, we turn out pockets, upend purses, shake loose all of our change, feed every last dollar to the jukebox. We keep dancing, no matter what the cost. And I believe that this poem was also written in 2017, maybe a little bit later in the year. And its title takes a phrase that was being used in the White House at the time, and it's still, unfortunately, a phrase that I kind of hear echoing in my mind. It's called, "Now is not the time to talk about gun control." After her honeymoon, Katie returns to work. She makes sure to back her truck into the lot so her Oregonian sticker is visible to us all. Keenan, the new hire, asks where to go in the event of an active shooter. These walls are all windows. In the team meeting, Katie does not cry when she tells us how, the night they arrived back in the States, her new husband was stupid just the once, blew away his right knee cleaning a loaded gun. "I'm lucky I was home," Katie says. No one asks about the safety, if he checked the chamber after he dropped the magazine. Later, at our desks, winter sun glares across our screens, dares us to look outside. Keenan pulls the blinds. "At least we would see them coming," he says. He taps the glass, lowers the shade on Katie's tailgate, just married, still soaped on the black paint. And this is the last poem about guns, because I did say I was going to move towards something lighter at the end. But this one was one I wrote last year, and it borrows a couple phrases from a couple different sources. The title of it is "Make an Effort to Remember, or Failing That Invent," which is a quote from Monique Fatigue's Les Guerrières. And then the last word of each line, as well as a couple words in the poem that you'll probably be able to hear, they borrow from Police Captain Jay Baker's comments about Robert Aaron Long, who was the shooter who murdered 8 people in Atlanta last March. And reading down the right side of the poem, it says, "Yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did." Make an effort to remember, or failing that, invent. I do not remember a life without guns. There was no yesterday into which I can make my escape, no homeland to go back to except this one. Was I always so afraid? When did I learn to make up this face, to pretend a call, a whistle from across the street doesn't make my skin crawl? Do I really have to paint the picture of a man with a gun? It doesn't matter if it is bad form to say, I do not want to punish him. It doesn't matter what I want is a day where any of us, out for a jog, at our jobs, sitting at our desks at school, watching for the bird that flew past, still hear its song. Let it arrive without a thought of him, the man with the gun, coming for us. Consider what it means to say he was fed up and at the end of his rope. I am also not without hope, not without compassion this spring day, where the sun is merciless, does not spare us as we march again. What is ever enough? What will satisfy this hunger to be just, left alone for once? What can I offer my aunt, my grandmother, worried to go for a walk? This is what he does. Even now, we watch out for the bird. It must exist. We saw it. We did. We did. And I'll end with, I think, 2 poems. It is Pride Month this month, and it's also a time when we're seeing an uptick in laws that are meant to diminish the dignity and humanity of queer and trans people, especially queer and trans youth. So these last 2 poems are both speaking of and speaking to queer youth. This is Letter to Half a Lifetime Ago. Dear girl waiting outside, alone, just tossed out of your parents' house, I offer this age's adage, it gets better. Sometimes it does. Other people's mothers will take you in, admit the sins to leave a kid on the streets, but they'll turn too when they find your fingers twined in their daughter's hair. You'll seek bars where you don't get carded, linger under the beneficent reign of queens who bring you to diners in the wee hours, make sure you eat. You'll play pool with butches who teach you to flick your lighter open, chivalrous, although you don't smoke, how to shave your head when barbers won't, what to do when men eye you in a parking lot, hurl insults, then rocks. You'll learn the exact size of bruise left by a fist, the shape of the girl who lifts you, carries you to her car, her home, lets you sleep while she cooks you eggs and toast. She'll lend you book after book, whole pages underlined, where you glimpse worlds of 2 women together, fictions where they do what they please with their lives, and still they survive. When she declares you just a friend, you'll write your gloom and grief, won't cry. You'll drink until your mind's scrubbed clean, then test sobriety at clubs where you press sweat to bass and drums. You'll wear studded leather, white tanks, black boots, signals that say both fuck off and come here. You'll fall gobsmacked, and they'll fall too. Broken beauties, motorcycle chicks, punk princesses, gyno-anarchists. Each time you'll buzz with kisses you wish wouldn't stop, embraces in the midst of busy sidewalks, bustle around you forgotten. Each will leave you waiting, cast off, alone again, but now knowing this isn't the end, that you'll see your way through with one long, steady stride, and the next one, and the next. And this will be the last poem. Thank you again for listening. It's called Dive. Every Friday and Saturday night, and sometimes Thursdays too, we would drive the highway out from the college town, past farmland, turn down that road that led deep into the forest. In the dark, we parked and followed the unlit path, Hansels and Gretels flocking, hungry, to our gingerbread shack, sweets hidden behind a plain facade, unmarked save for a rainbow draped over the door. Inside, we threaded dollars into the jukebox, into the spangled straps of each queen's dress, blew kisses to share lookalikes, to our friend who sauntered and swiveled to Shania, who worked days as a fry cook and nights the crowd, who knew we too hadn't been impressed much, had, oh man, felt like a woman sidling up, pulling us to the floor to sway under lazy purple lights to Macy Gray, might leave us dizzy for days. I have forgotten the names of all the butches who bought me drinks, of the flanneled bartender who played 8-ball in the hour after last call, of even the bar itself, but still recall the pleather chairs that stuck red welts to my thighs, that creaked as I plied beautiful strangers with cigarettes. Still remember their sports bras under white tanks, the thunk of chunky boots, flecks of forearms as they ran thin fingers through my fade, the delirious crush of weight when they sank onto my lap. What fool would wish for such a place now? Secret space that appeared on no map, that offered not quite safety, only its dim copy. What ingrate would spare a thought for the bad old days when we had to wander so far from home, roam through fields and thickets, into hushed woods to find our kin, our tribe? Still, it's there I learned the slide of hips on hips, grip of a belt buckle under my hands to draw a body close, how to lure and hook with one long look in a room brimming with long looks. It was the cage where we hid until we could escape, biding time behind those glittered walls. It was no dive, but a fall, head first into this ever after, which will have us as we are, or not at all. Thank you.
Wow. Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think I want to first compliment you on your lung capacity. Because we heard your poem. We heard your poem, there was one sentence, and you said, I'll see about my lung capacity. So, very nice job with that. I love, too, the new poem. You told us that you finished a poem, I think it was just this morning.
Yeah, I'm still not sure if it's finished, but
Right,
we'll see.
right. And then you started with Dear Ghost. And after that introduction to the poem and then Dear Ghost, I thought that was just wonderful.
Oh, thank
So we're virtual, of course, but I would like you to imagine long, sustained applause. So if we were here live with a live audience, there would be sustained applause.
Oh, thank you.
So we would like to give you a hand again. Thank you very much for that. For whatever reason, I don't have a live chat here.
Okay.
And so I think what we'll do is that we will have a conversation here. We have some questions for you. And then Jennifer is going to end the event with a final poem. And we can also see if there are questions in the chat that we want to take up later in writing. So we have
Okay.
done that once before. And I do send out a broadside of the poem, your poem that was on the broadside. And so if we're able to do that, we can send out answers to questions that are in the chat. So we'll take a look at that after the reading, and I can send something to you, and you can send, if it works, some answers
Sounds
to
good.
them, and we'll send it out.
Okay.
We'll try that. So why don't we start, and let me ask the first question, which is, who are you reading now? Who are you reading, and who would you say have influenced you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because this question often comes up, and I feel like I'm never reading poetry right before I do a poetry reading. So lately, I've been reading a lot of comfort reads. I recently read John Scalzi's Kaiju Preservation Society, which is like a very whimsical science fiction book. And he even in his sort of endnotes to the book says, this is a pop song of a book. It's meant to be, I think, comforting. And I think recently I've just needed that. But some of the books that I've been reading lately that have maybe influenced my writing more have actually been graphic memoirs. I reread Mira Jacobs' Good Talk for probably the third or fourth time about a month or two ago. And that book, if those of you listening have not read it, I highly recommend it. I think it's very nuanced in the way that she writes about family relationships, about race, about politics and political difference. And it's really helped me to think about how do I want to address those topics in my poems in ways that are not just, hopefully, not just polemics, that have some more nuance to them. Mm-hmm. And I also read recently another graphic memoir, Kristen Radke's Seek You.
It was what?
Seek You, SEEKYOU.
Uh-huh.
Which I believe the subtitle of it is A Journey Through American Loneliness.
Ah.
And it's these sort of essays written in the form of sort of comics or graphic memoirs. And I think they're stunning both in the artwork, but also the concision with which she can make really like researched, complicated notions about like the science behind loneliness and sort of different technological phenomenon that may or may not contribute to loneliness, and do it in this way that is just succinct, and it's something that I aspire to do in poems and sometimes get to and probably sometimes don't.
Have you started to see that come into practice in your poems?
I think I've honestly, I think, had seen that influence show up more in, I've been writing essays over the last year or so, and I can definitely see it show up there. It's maybe harder for me to, I think I'm so focused on concision in poetry that it's probably there and I just take it for granted. But in essays, I sometimes get verbose, and I think looking at her work has been a good way of trying to make me stick to the kinds of constraints that I might otherwise put on myself in poetry, but don't usually do in prose.
Constraints that you put on yourself in poetry. Could you say a little about that? What do you mean?
Yeah, I think I'm, as you might have been able to tell from some of these poems that I read, I'm really interested in formal constraints and the way that, especially when I have things that I want to write about that are really overwhelming or just I don't know where to start because they're so big.
Yeah.
That a formal constraint of some kind, whether it's borrowing a phrase from somebody else or having this elaborate scheme of excluding letters or whatever it is, it helps me to just focus my mind on one single way of approaching things. And so I think that even some of the poems where you may not have been able to notice the constraint, there probably still was one. Like I use syllabics a lot or other kinds of things that probably I will only know are there, but they're meant to help me to just fine tune the language in a way that I probably wouldn't if it weren't there.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Thank you.
Oh.
Talking about excluding letters, you talked about a form in your reading, quite an elaborate form. Could you say something about that again?
Yeah.
I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you.
Yeah, I love this form. Everyone I can talk to about it who won't just like look glazed over, I will happily tell them about it. It's called The Beautiful Outlaw. It's in Oulipo form, which is a group of French poets and mathematicians and artists who, among other things, did a lot of thinking about how constraints could drive creativity. And so they invented lots of different kinds of poetic constraints. And one of them was this beautiful outlaw. And so the idea behind it is you can write as many stanzas as you want to, but in each stanza, one letter has to be excluded, and all of the other letters of the alphabet have to be included. And then the excluded letters must spell out the title of the poem. So I was introduced to this by Broadsided Press. They put out a call specifically for poems in this form, and I don't know how many submissions they actually got because I can't imagine a ton of people were writing them, though maybe. But I wrote one, and then I just kept writing them. I've probably written like at least a dozen at this point, just
Oh, you do?
because they're so, again, for things that are really sort of nagging at me, but I can't quite find a way to say it. It really forces me to be very precise with my language.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any questions you've got?
Well, I want to know how you started writing poetry and what was your first poem or your first poems?
That's a good question. I think I have a couple of different answers. So the first poem that I truly know that I wrote, although there may have been ones before this, was probably in 5th grade. I think I still have a copy of it. And it's about, I think it's about religious faith, like the religion that I grew up in. And it's very short. But when I think about sort of the origins of maybe becoming a writer, becoming a poet, I tend to think of a poem that I wrote in, it's been 10th or 11th grade in high school. I had a teacher who assigned us to read The Scarlet Letter. And as a response afterwards, we could write an essay about it or a research paper, or she suggested we could write a poem in response. And I was kind of curious. I'd never written a poem for a class before that I could remember. And I asked her, what kinds of things might I do? Like, what would a poem in response to this book be? And she said, well, for instance, you could take one of the characters and write a poem from their perspective. So I chose Pearl, who was Hester Prynne's daughter, and wrote a poem from her perspective. And there was something about, I think, adopting that persona that opened up poetry to me in a way that I hadn't understood it before, and made me realize that I could write about maybe things that I was thinking about or curious about through that mask. And so that's maybe the truer origin of my first poems.
Finding a way into the poem. Finding a way into what you want to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still doing it, just with other techniques.
Yeah, but very important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I'd like to ask you about your book
Yes.
again. Could you talk about writing that? What was hard about it? What was easy about it? How did you put it together?
Yeah. So that book, it was written, it was originally written not to be a book. It was written as a project that I undertook because I didn't know what else to do. I was very, in a state, I don't even know if I have the words for it even still. I was in a state after the election of Donald Trump and wanted to respond in some way or felt like I needed to create something in some way as a response. And what I chose to do was from Inauguration Day and the first 100 days afterwards, I wrote a poem a day. And there was a sort of elaborate ritual of constraints involved, as there is in everything. But the main sort of focus of the project was I would choose one word that I had heard being used or frequently misused by Trump or by the sort of campaign surrounding him. And I would take that word and try to remember what that word had meant to me prior to 2015. And write into that. So I generated like 100 poems, some of which were, because I was writing one every day, some of which were not so great. And then sometime later, somebody was reading them and said, you know, you should think about trying to shape this into a book and see what would happen. And so I pulled out the poems that I thought had some something beyond their initial making in them, and sort of reordered them and put them together as the book again. And I think, you know, you asked what was hard about it. I think it was hard for me to sort of reconceptualize this thing that I made just to sort of sustain me for this like time period where I was very confused and dismayed and alarmed, and take it and create it into something that was meant for an audience instead of just for myself. It's probably the hardest piece.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Final question before we get to your final poem.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything we haven't asked you in this conversation that you want to tell people that are listening here or will be listening to this reading?
Oh my goodness.
In 1 minute?
That is a wildly open-ended question.
Yes, isn't it?
Maybe the only thing I would say is that perhaps related to that last response to the last question you just asked is if there's anyone out there listening to this or watching this, if you have the impulse to create or to make a poem, to do so, whether you think that there's going to be an audience for it or not, that there's something I think truly important in the act of making, whether or not something is ever read or heard by anybody else. So I try to live by that, and would encourage anybody else to try that out too if they're interested.
Well, thank you very much. Very well said.
Thanks.
Yeah. Shall we hear your final poem?
Yes. So you mentioned earlier that I lead wilderness outings in nature. And I hesitate to even use those words, wilderness and nature, because everything is nature. And at this point, nothing is truly wild anymore. But I've been trying to write more and more about the experiences that I have in those spaces. And so this poem, many of these poems about those experiences are about plants, just experiences with plants or with animals that are usually overlooked. And so this is a poem about the plant beargrass, which is also sometimes known as soap grass or basket grass or quip quip. Forgive me. How many times did I see your arching fountains of olive blades before I knew your name? Even then, how long did it take before I recognized what a mistake it is to describe you with words given to us by men on an expedition who saw only your resemblance to their experience? They had not learned enough to know your tufts were not grass at all. How often had I witnessed you in this form, tussocks tenacious enough to endure drought and frost, before I found myself struck by luck, a whole meadow of your many bodies, tall stalks rising into clusters of cream flowers blooming from the bottom up. Even now, I cannot detail each way I perceived you. Pale breasts with tightly budded nipples, mounds of marshmallow fluff, cotton swabs, fields of froth, fireworks fizzling as they burst, haute couture of delicate lacework. Each likeness falls short, does not praise how you're the first to arrive after fire, how your rhizomes survive mudslides to sprout bounties of green shoots, how you wait years for just the right amount of rain to blossom, to adorn some unsuspecting clearing with your brash display. How often will I pass through the same stretch and never again catch, no, be caught by, such exuberance? I still come across your seas of verdant puffs, let them brush my knees. Now I call you quip-quip, term whose exact sense I can't trace, but on its face suggests the joke's on me, wishing for what's past, stumbling on wonder once, and believing I can make it last.
Jennifer, thank you so much
Thank you.
for being here with us tonight. Thank you for the wonderful reading. It's been a delight. Our next reading is going to be July 13th. We're going to be here with a tribute to our friend Ann Staley. So thank you for being with us tonight. Please join us then. I'm Tom Hogan for the Milwaukie Poetry Series. Good night.